What waits for you at the top of a forgotten tower isn't always a view. The weight of the silent woods pressed in from all sides, a suffocating blanket of pine needles and shadows that swallowed the sound of our own footsteps. Leo, walking a pace ahead, seemed attuned to a different frequency, his excitement a faint, buzzing static against the overwhelming quiet, while my own senses screamed that every step deeper into this forgotten basin was a mistake. We had left the vague, overgrown logging road an hour ago, guided only by the persistent on my phone's GPS that promised a structure on this hilltop. A promise that felt increasingly like a trap as the gray light of the overcast sky did little to pierce the permanent twilight beneath the canopy. There were no animal sounds, no distant bird calls, not even the sigh of wind through the highest branches. Just the thick, muffled silence and the occasional crunch of a long dead branch underfoot. The air itself tasted stale, carrying the faint, sweet-sour tang of decay not from a single source but from the earth itself, as if the forest floor was one vast, slow compost heap. We found no trail, no blazes on trees, no discarded trash or rusted cans that would signal the occasional passage of other humans. This place felt pristine in its abandonment, untouched not out of reverence but out of a conscious avoidance, as if the land itself had been quarantined. The coordinates had come from a user whose entire post history was a cryptogram of abandoned places. His final message before deleting the account reading simply, "Some lookouts watch for more than fire." And now, with the battery on my phone dipping below 30% and the tree cover making the GPS signal stutter, the ominous weight of that warning settled in my gut like a stone. Leo, ever the optimist, pointed out a slight break in the uniformity of the trunks ahead, a gathering of light that suggested a clearing, and with a renewed vigor born of anticipation, he pushed forward, leaving me to follow into a space where the trees reluctantly gave way to a rough circle of tall, yellowed grass and, at its center, the crooked silhouette of the lookout cabin. It was not the proud, stilted tower I had pictured from old forestry posters, but a low, hunched thing built of logs turned the color of old bone. Its windows not just dirty but opaque with a grimy film that seemed to sweat from the wood, and the whole structure listed to one side as if the hill was slowly shrugging it off. We circled it once, the grass whispering against our jeans, and the only sound was the protesting groan of the warped wood as Leo placed a hand on the wall. His earlier excitement now tempered into a focused curiosity, while I stood back, my eyes tracing the line of the partially caved-in roof and the strange, dark stains that streaked the siding beneath the broken shingles, stains that looked too thick and deliberate to be mere water damage. He didn't bother knocking. The door, slightly ajar, swung inward with a scream of corroded hinges that tore the perfect silence to shreds, and from the black rectangle of the interior drifted out a smell that was unmistakable, old smoke, damp earth, and beneath it all, the coppery, faint scent of rust, or something very much like it. We stepped inside, and the darkness was not complete but a murky twilight, the grime on the windows filtering the gray day into a sickly greenish hue that did little to illuminate the junk scattered across the plank floor. Not just old tools, but the specific unsettling detritus of interrupted life. A single mud-caked boot lying on its side, a chipped enamel plate with the fossilized remains of a meal, a paperback novel swollen with moisture, its pages fused into a solid block. And on the far wall, perfectly centered, was the note, a stark white rectangle in the gloom. The clean, printed words, "Was it worth it?" seeming to glow with their own malevolent intent, a question that felt less like a joke and more like the first line of an indictment we had unknowingly walked into, sealing our presence here as an answer in the affirmative. We set up camp in that oppressive space as dusk bled the last of the light from the sky, the process of unrolling sleeping bags and lighting the camp stove made clumsy and tense by the watching silence of the cabin, the feeling that the walls themselves were absorbing our heat, our sound, our very presence, and when we finally sat to eat, the silence between us was no longer comfortable but charged, a live wire of unspoken dread that neither of us dared to cut. The night that followed was not marked by dramatic events but by a deepening of that dread, a slow seepage of fear into the foundations of our minds, as the cabin settled around us with noises that were just a half beat out of sync with the wind, creaks that came from unweighted corners, and a cold that gathered not from the air but seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves, coiling around our sleeping bags until sleep became a fragmented series of jerks back into wakefulness, each time, finding the darkness thicker, the silence heavier, the question on the wall throbbing in the periphery of my vision. I woke, heart already pounding, to a blackness so absolute it felt solid, and the immediate, instinctual knowledge that Leo was gone. His sleeping bag of vacant, crumpled shell beside me, and before I could even whisper his name, the sound came from directly above. A slow, patient, weighty thud that vibrated through the rafters, a sound that spoke of mass and intention, not a branch or an animal, but something that walked with purpose across the roof, pausing directly over where I lay paralyzed, the seconds stretching into a small eternity before the footsteps moved on, tracing a path to the far edge and then stopping, leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise, a silence that was suddenly broken by the door swinging open and Leo's silhouette stumbling in, his breath fogging in the sudden influx of marginally less dark air. He claimed he'd just stepped out, the woods calling to him in a way he couldn't explain, but his eyes in the weak beam of my headlamp were wide, the pupils swallowed by the dark, and he couldn't or wouldn't explain the shallow, rapid pattern of his breath or the way his hands trembled as he zipped his bag back up, and we did not speak of the roof or the footsteps, or the way the note on the wall seemed to drink in the beam of my light, the letters appearing for a moment to be not printed, but carved deep into the paper by a frantic, unsteady hand. The second day dawned not with light but with a gradual lessening of the dark, the cabin revealing itself again in shades of gray and brown, every detail now seeming ominous and loaded with meaning. The pattern of the water stains on the ceiling looked like a distorted face. The arrangement of junk on the floor felt deliberately placed to form a symbol we couldn't decipher. We ate a breakfast in near total silence, the events of the night a chasm between us that was too wide to bridge with words, and made a half-hearted attempt to explore the immediate woods, a venture that felt futile and exposed, the endless, identical trees offering no landmarks, no vistas, only a claustrophobic maze that seemed to shift subtly behind our backs. The hunter appeared at the edge of the clearing just as the gray afternoon light began to fail, his arrival silent and absolute, as if he had simply resolved into being from the shadows of the tree line. A man in worn, earth-toned clothing, his face a mask of grime and matted hair, the rifle on his shoulder not a tool but an extension of his own grim posture. His eyes, when they met mine across the 40 feet of clearing, held no curiosity, no hostility, not even the blankness of madness, but a profound and unsettling vacancy, as if the person who once lived behind them had been meticulously scraped out, leaving only a polished shell that reflected the dying light and our own frightened faces back at us. My call to him echoed weirdly in the still air, swallowed quickly by the trees, and he did not startle or acknowledge it in any way. He simply stared for 3 more heartbeats, then turned with a slow, deliberate pivot and walked into the wall of pines, his form disappearing between 2 trunks without a sound, leaving us with the cold certainty that his departure was not a retreat, but a repositioning. We spent the evening in a state of heightened alert, jumping at every natural sound of the settling cabin. Our conversation a strained series of whispers about leaving at first light, plans that felt flimsy and hopelessly distant as the darkness outside the windows became complete, a black oil that pressed against the glass. It was during one of these hushed debates that the shadow moved. A liquid darkness that slid across Leo's face, blotting out the warm glow of our lantern, and I turned to see the shape outside the window, a humanoid silhouette but wrong in its proportions, too tall and too thin, its movement a smooth, soundless glide along the exterior wall. It passed the first window, then the second, its path taking it unerringly toward the door, and in the terrible silence that followed we could only wait, our breaths held, until the 3 knocks came, not loud but intimate, as if the thing outside was tapping directly on the bones of our inner ears. Leo's movement to slam the bolt home was pure animal reflex, the metallic clang a shocking violation of the quiet, and the response was immediate 3 colossal, shattering blows that shook the door in its frame and sent a rain of dust from the ceiling, blows that carried not anger, but a terrible, testing strength, as if the thing outside was gauging the resistance of our fragile wooden shell. What followed was an eternity of frozen terror, our ears straining for any sound of retreat, hearing nothing but the frantic drum of our own hearts, until Leo, moved by a desperation I could feel radiating from him, slowly slid the bolt back and opened the door a crack to reveal an empty clearing washed in the cold light of a now visible moon. A scene of such normalcy it felt like a mockery. We did not sleep. We sat with our backs to the wall, staring at the door and the windows, watching for the return of the shadow, until the first pallid hints of dawn seeped through the grime, and with a wordless consensus, we packed our gear with frantic speed and fled the cabin, not looking back, feeling the weight of the note's question on our backs as we plunged into the woods. The hike out was a nightmarish reversal of our journey in, every strange tree and silent hollow now feeling like a deliberate part of a trap we were only just escaping. The sensation of being watched so intense it was a physical pressure between my shoulder blades, and when we finally broke through to the overgrown logging road and saw the dusty shape of our car, the relief was so profound it felt like a physical blow. The digital aftermath was the final seal on the horror. The Reddit user's account scrubbed from existence. His few other posts vanished. The entire thread memory hold as if it had never been, leaving us with no proof, no context, nothing but the visceral, rotting memory of those 2 nights and the unshakable conviction that the hunter and the thing that knocked were not the same entity, but 2 different kinds of predator in the same forsaken territory, and we had wandered into the space between them. The story of the storm shelter begins not with the tower, but with the slow, sickening drop in barometric pressure that made the air feel thick and charged hours before the first cloud appeared. A palpable heaviness that Scout, my Australian shepherd, reacted to with a low, continuous whine deep in his throat. His eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains bit into a sky that was slowly turning the color of a fresh bruise, purple and yellow and green in unnatural swirls. We were on a firebreak trail, a raw gash of gravel and hardpan cut through the forest, and the plan had been simple. A brisk hike to the retired lookout marked on my outdated map, a few photos for my blog, then a descent to a known creekside campsite by nightfall, a plan that disintegrated as the first fat, cold raindrops struck the dry earth with audible pats, and the wind, previously absent, rose from a sigh to a shriek in a matter of minutes, carrying with it the ozone smell of lightning and a temperature drop that cut through my jacket. The tower, when we reached it, was a stark, white-painted cylinder on stilts, a lonely sentinel on the ridge, and the moment we burst inside, the storm unleashed its full fury, the rain transforming from a fall into a solid, roaring wall of water that hammered on the metal roof with a deafening, mind-numbing violence, while the wind grabbed the tower and shook it in its concrete fists, making the entire structure sway with a nauseating, groaning pendulum motion. Inside was a barren, dusty space, empty save for a rusted iron stove bolted to the floor in one corner and the skeletal remains of a chair. The windows streaked with decades of hard water stains that turned the apocalyptic view outside into a blurred, impressionist painting of chaos. I made a nest for us in the lee of the stove, unrolling my sleeping bag on the grimy floorboards, but Scout would not settle, his distress surpassing any normal fear of thunder. He paced the perimeter of the room, sniffing frantically at the base of the walls and the joins in the floor, his tail clamped down, emitting a thin, keening whimper that was barely audible over the storm's roar. It was during a brief, sudden lull in the rain's intensity, a pocket of eerie quiet in the maelstrom, that I heard the first sound from below, a distinct, hollow clunk of metal on metal, a sound that was not part of the tower's protest against the wind, but something moving within it or beneath it, a sound that was answered a few seconds later by a scrape, like something heavy being dragged across a concrete surface. I told myself it was the wind catching a loose piece of siding, a cable slapping in the gale, any rational explanation. But the look in Scout's eyes held a pure, animal terror that mirrored the cold not forming in my own stomach, and he refused to come to me, planting himself by the door and staring at it as if it were the only thing holding back a tide of darkness. Sleep, when it came, was a shallow, feverish thing, filled with dreams of drowning in rising black water, and I woke not to the storm's cacophony but to a silence so profound and absolute it felt like a physical void. The sudden absence of noise as shocking as an explosion, my watch glowing in the dark to show 2:17 a.m., and Scout was already at the door, not whining now, but utterly still, his body rigid, his nose pressed to the crack at the bottom, letting out a faint, high-pressed squeak of need. The world outside was a different planet, dripping, gleaming in the weak starlight that pierced the shredded clouds, every leaf and blade of grass holding a jewel of rainwater, the air cold and cleansed of all smell, the silence so heavy it seemed to ring in my ears. I followed Scout down the trembling wooden stairs, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky cone through the dark, and he quickly did his business, but instead of returning, he stood frozen, staring back under the tower where the stilts created a cave of shadows. The metallic squeak came again, a tiny, oil-starved sound, and I turned the beam to see the pair of old galvanized steel cellar doors, half sunk into the mud and overgrown with weed. Their presence here under a fire lookout inexplicable and immediately, intuitively wrong. The memory of the night sounds crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. They were the sounds of those doors opening, of footsteps on the steps within. Setting the flashlight on the ground to angle under the tower, its light trembling with the beat of my heart, I approached and grasped the cold, wet handle of one door, the rust biting into my palm, and heaved it open, the hinges screaming into the perfect silence, the beam of light plunging down a short, steep flight of concrete steps that vanished into a perfect blackness, and on each step, glistening with fresh moisture, was the clear, defined imprint of a bare foot, the toes splayed, the mud from the forest floor tracking upward into the darkness below. Scout's bark was a single, sharp, and utterly terrified explosion of sound that tore the night in two, and I dropped the door, spinning to see him facing the tree line. His whole body a tense arrow, a low growl rumbling from his chest as he stared into the black wall of pines where, for just a fraction of a second, I saw a darker patch of shadow detach itself and melt backward into the nothingness. There was no thought, only a primal imperative to flee. I snatched up the flashlight, called Scout to my heel with a voice I didn't recognize, and we took the stairs back up to the tower two at a time, where I performed the frantic, clumsy ballet of stuffing my sleeping bag and supplies into my pack with numb fingers, all the while expecting to hear the creak of the stairs behind me. We fled down the firebreak trail at a stumbling run, the beam of my light a frantic, jumping pool on the gravel ahead, and after a mile, with my lungs burning and the rain beginning again in a cold, miserable drizzle, I stopped, turned, and pointed the light back the way we had come, aiming it up the ridge toward the tower, now just a faint geometric shape against the marginally lighter sky, and there, under its belly, I could see two small, square patches of absolute black where the cellar doors stood wide open, an invitation to the void that we had just refused. The ranger's voice on the phone the next morning was flat, professional, and terminally closed, a wall of bureaucratic concrete. And when I gave the coordinates and described the tower, there was a long pause filled with the sound of a keyboard clicking before he stated, in a tone that allowed for zero argument, that the structure had been permanently decommissioned and was off-limits to the public due to hazardous and unstable conditions. And the finality in that statement, the careful, legal phrasing, was more terrifying than any ghost story, for it told me that the authorities knew, and their solution was simply to lock the door and post a sign, leaving whatever was inside to its own devices. If you need help expanding a specific section of your story with more detail or description, let me know and I can provide focused assistance. If these stories got under your skin, do the channel Winds of Thought a solid and hit that like button. It helps more people find these forgotten tales. Tell us in the comments, which story would haunt you the most?